A lot of performance programs looks productive from the outside. More training sessions, more workshop, more playbooks, more manager meetings and meetings with other stakeholders, more certification. But 6 months later down the line, the same problems are still there. That's what often gets observed. Discovery quality is inconsistent, maybe forecasts are unreliable, quality varies heavily across teams. Managers say the reps know the process and what has been taught, but execution still doesn't go as it should. And in many cases, the organization has actually increased the amount of effort required to sell, which is absurd in some ways. So that's the part most teams never stop to consider. Not just are people doing the thing, but the most important question is that is the performance we're actually creating worth producing? The idea sits underneath the planning phase of the sales enablement program framework I have created. I'll link the full guide and one pager in the description below because they go much deeper into the overall model, the execution structure, and the diagnostic approach that works together with the planning system. But in this video, I want to focus on one important principle that completely changes how you design enablement programs. The idea comes from performance engineering, particularly in the work of Thomas Gilbert, on the topic of worthy performance. So his argument is pretty straightforward. So performance only matters when the value of what people produce exceeds the total cost required to produce it. And once you apply that lens to enablement, a lot of common program design starts to look inefficient pretty quickly. So hopefully what we'll discuss today in this video will help you spot that early on so that you don't make the mistake of creating a program that ultimately is bound essentially to fail. One of the biggest mistakes is treating activity as progress. So more training, more process, more behavioral reinforcement, all of those things, even if they seem to create progress, none of those are the actual goal. The goal is to improve the quality of the commercial outputs that influence business outcomes and to make those outputs sustainable to produce at scale, especially if you work obviously in a larger organization. That's an important distinction because sellers do not directly produce win rate or revenue, and it's something that is not fully in their control. They produce outputs that contribute to those outcomes that are somewhat linked to them. Here we are talking about so many things depending on what you're focused on. We're talking about discovery summaries, qualification, stakeholder maps, mutual action plan, proposal business cases, deal reviews, etc., etc. Those are the controllable execution results inside the commercial system. And the question becomes how much organizational effort does it take to consistently produce high quality versions of those outputs? That's where the concept of worthy performance comes into play and becomes very useful, okay? Because the cost side of the equation is much broader than what you think. We're not just talking about financial costs. We're talking about seller time. We're talking about manager coaching overhead. We're talking about the amount of process friction, the cognitive load for the rep, tool complexity, training hours, or just general operational coordination. Obviously, all of these together could potentially be calculated financially, but just to give you an idea of that's what we mean by the overall cost. And if all that effort increases faster than the quality and volume of the outputs that we're trying to produce that are connected to business outcome, the program becomes difficult to sustain and ultimately could actually make things worse, even if engagement might look like initially, but engagement doesn't equal result, as we all know. So let's say an organization wants to improve discovery quality. Like the default response is often, okay, we need discovery training. So the enablement team builds workshops, certification, role plays, code libraries, associated to that coaching session, and maybe some reinforcement plan. Now, compare that to a different approach. So the organization defines what good discovery output actually looks like, what managers should inspect, what evidence should exist in the relevant tools, and what a strong discovery package should contain before an opportunity progresses. So that might include clear standards, example of strong and weak outputs, inspection rubrics, lightweight workflow changes, and manager review cadences. So in many cases, that creates better execution with far less organizational cost or behavioral cost, we can also say. That's the idea. Not how do we maximize enablement activity, that's never the goal. It's more about what is the minimum effective intervention that improve performance meaningfully. So if we think in that way, we have much bigger chances to provide great value to the organization. You realize as well that diagnosis becomes much more important because capability gaps are only one category of problems. The real issue very often lies with other things like unclear standards, so people don't know really what they're supposed to do, poor workflow design, absence of reinforcement, no manager inspection whatsoever, missing information, or just operational friction. And training is one of the most expensive interventions you can actually make in an organization. It's still important in many cases, but it needs to be matched to a real capability problem. And often a lot of organizational problem, nothing to do with capability itself. And the reason why training is very expensive, so to speak, is because it consumes seller attention, manager capacity, a lot of effort that should go into reinforcement, and just takes away obviously from the live selling time. So if the gap can be solved through simpler systems, clearer outputs, a better inspection process, those interventions often create a higher value performance at a lower behavioral cost. And in my guide, I introduced this idea of the minimum effective lever. So not every problem will need all of the lever that we know about: training, coaching, content, process redesign, tools. Sometimes the highest value program is actually the lightest that works, that addresses the real critical gap that has been identified. So I would say that a useful question during planning is, how much effort is this program asking the organization to sustain every week? Because some programs only work under ideal conditions. Managers need a huge amount of coaching time, seller need constant reinforcement, enablement needs ongoing manual intervention, and operations team needs to provide some more elaborated reporting and support. So the program technically functions, but only through continuous effort, which in most organizations, actually, that's not possible. And realizing these constraints is very important. And that's why I come back to the idea of the minimum enablement lever set. So strong enablement programs should make execution easier, clearer, and more repeatable inside normal work within the constraint of the actual work itself. The behavior should persist because the workflow makes sense, not because the organization is constantly forcing compliance. The last thing you want is to create something I call like a performance debt. So every new layer of process, training, inspection, or reinforcement adds cost to the system. So if the increase in output quality does not justify the cost, the program becomes harder to maintain over time. And again, there won't be not even the point to pursue that in the first place. Something to be very aware, and that's what truly represents the idea of worthy performance. If you want to use like this principle immediately, I will recommend starting with one active enablement request, look at what things the business is asking for, and then ask two questions about that. First, what outputs actually needs to improve in order to achieve that particular outcome. By outputs, we mean the tangible things that the specific target audience that we have should produce that is mostly in their control. We're not talking about behaviors here. The behaviors are underneath those outputs, and we're not talking about like training. Then we want to ask, what is currently making the outputs difficult to produce in a consistent way and to the standard required? Now you can diagnose properly. Maybe the issue lies in capabilities, skills, and knowledge, but maybe, as we said before, it can be in other areas like around information availability, around the kind of workflow people are going through, the fact that people don't know what good looks like, and unnecessary complexity caused by something. So that changes completely the intervention and usually leads to a smaller yet more focused and sustainable program. So to close, I would say that the best enablement system are the ones that are focused on improving execution quality with the least unnecessary friction. That's the idea behind worthy performance. Better outputs, lower behavioral costs, and performance that makes sense inside real work with the real constraint. If you want the deeper framework, the full guide and one-pager that are linked below in the description, they go into the planning model, the diagnostic structure, the selection of the different levers, and the various phases like execution phase, but also how you end up like demonstrating value through measurement. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.